transformation. This word has become a big part of the South African political vocabulary and political language. Yet, I would like to present to you that what has actually been experienced in the last 20 years of South Africa has been fake transformation. It scrapes the top of the barrel and convinces us that race swapping in management positions is economically transformative, that inflating the cost of goods and services and selling them to the most impoverished communities who need access to government provided services such as healthcare and education transforms the economy, whilst it actually aims to help enrich the few politically connected who have access to those economic opportunities. It pretends that it is not the friends and families or the politicians themselves who have amassed enormous amounts of wealth as a result of racialized redress. That is fake transformation, and that is what has been unfolding in South Africa over the past 20 years. Welcome all. My name is Makone Maja. I am the IRR campaigns manager. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Anthea Jeffery, and together we will be making the distinction, separating the wheat from the chaff between fake transformation and true transformation. Simultaneously, we will be thrashing out the IRR's bold and daring proposal that makes the submission to you all that true transformation that not only uplifts the poor from poverty and achieves economic inclusion, but does not require discriminating on the basis of race can truly be achieved. This proposal is in the form of draft policy legislation, and it is part of the IRR's What South Africa Can Be campaign. It is namely the Freedom from Poverty Bill. A few of its daring and bold offers include replacing BEE with EED, Economic Empowerment for the Disadvantaged. This will be the primary focus of our webinar, so more on this shortly. It introduces a voucher system for welfare beneficiaries who can redeem these vouchers within the healthcare and education programs. It repeals racialized empowerment laws and race-based obstacles to growth, because in order to grow this economy, to bring people who have been marginalized into the economy, first the economy needs to grow. And in order to grow, people need to get jobs. Those jobs will help make goods and services that will then increase, the wealth of this country. Anthea, thank you so much for joining us. I've prepared a few questions for you. But first, I should inform our audience that we will have a 30-minute discussion where I will ask Anthea questions, and afterwards we'll have a 15-minute Q&A. We intend to have a hard stop at 10:45. So whatever questions you have for Anthea, I assure you she can tackle them. She is an entire library when it comes to knowledge about topics such as this. Thank you so much, Anthea, for joining us. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Makone. Hoping I can live up to knowing an entire library. Bits of it, at least, I should be able to figure out.
I have all the confidence. Let's start by defining BEE. We'll give a background on what has been of transformation or fake transformation over the last 20 years before we introduce the concept of EED, which we intend to replace BEE with. BEE has many different elements, and it varies between all these different codes. Can you just thrash out what BEE means?
Sure. It is, in fact, a huge and very complex topic. So I think for purposes of today's discussion, it's best to focus just on two aspects of BEE and look at them in both the public and the private sectors. And those are employment equity under the Employment Equity Act and management control under the BEE sector codes. But in essence, what both require is the setting of racial targets, particularly at the management level. Under the BEE code for senior management, for example, the target is 60%. Junior management, it's 88%. And now, under the Employment Equity Act, we're soon going to have targets set by the minister without business having much scope to decide what those targets should best be. Then it comes to procurement, and we have provision in our laws for preferential procurement. And again, in the private sector, under the codes, businesses are expected to buy 80% of the goods and services they need from BEE empowered companies. About half of those BEE empowered companies are supposed to have 51% BEE ownership. Within the public sector, where it's enormously important, we have a government with a public procurement contract of 1.2 trillion rand a year, in terms of which the government at all levels is supposed to buy the goods and services that people need. But many of those contracts are going to BEE tenderpreneurs who charge inflated prices and who then very often don't deliver, and sometimes don't deliver at all. It's either an inadequate delivery or a complete failure to deliver, which means that there's an enormous waste in the public procurement space, a great deal not of value for money, which is what we most need, but of kickbacks and preferences going to a relatively small group of people who are often called BEE tenderpreneurs. Um, so those are the two elements, employment equity or targets in management and procurement, and both of them have a tremendously distorting effect. The aim of the side of the government is to say we should have demographic representativity in all spheres. So since Black people make up 80% of the economically active population, then they should also make up 80% of management and 80% of procurement contracts. The difficulty is that if you look at the definition of economically active people, it's everyone between the ages of 15 and 64 who either work or would like to work. And then you drill down a little bit more into the characteristics of the South African population, and we can see that the Black population in particular is predominantly a young population, with more than half under the age of 35, which means that many have never had the opportunity to develop the experience needed for management posts. If you look at skills, we have this very unfortunate situation where more than 80% of our schools are dysfunctional. So we have more than half again of pupils are coming out of schools still functionally illiterate and innumerate, and many of them don't even have the National Senior Certificate. So again, people who've had very little opportunity to develop what is needed for management or for success in delivering on contracts. The fact that many Black people sadly are unemployed, again, erodes the capacity. That if you look at the overall number of Black people with a degree, it's about 7% of the Black population, even though there has been a shift over time. So it just indicates that 80% as the target is unrealistic in many ways because it's failing to take account of important barriers. And it's more important to deal with those barriers and equip everybody with the capacity to move in time into top positions and valuable million dollar contracts than to give them prematurely to people who haven't really been adequately equipped to do the work. And then we also know that there's been a great deal of political abuse as well, that the ANC uses BEE very often as a way of drawing its cadres into a patronage network. And that's a critical way in which it retains its hold on power. So we have two problems, the unrealism underpinning many of the targets and the political abuse with the ANC seeing these empowerment as an opportunity to enrich cadres who are loyal to it.
Sure. Those are some staggering statistics when you think that, 80% is the target for BE in those junior management positions, as you said, but you only have 7% of, as you say, the Black population having degrees which can provide them or allow them to occupy those management positions. I think because we're trying to be solutions oriented today, if the government truly wanted to achieve genuine progress to ensure that Black people can acquire those positions at great numbers, you'd start with the education system, which, as you point out, a lot of our schools are just in a chaotic state. They are very dysfunctional. And unfortunately, there is a relationship there between BEE and, just poor service delivery. I'm particularly from Limpopo. There was a scandal a few years ago about textbooks not arriving on time. I'm sure the tenderpreneur was paid handsomely, but then you had these schools in rural Limpopo being stranded without access to basic learning materials. And their public disagreements about BEE has been at an all-time high. And I wonder what you attribute this to. It's also hard from the noise to decipher what's true about BEE and what isn't true about BEE. How would you respond to that?
Yeah. I think, firstly, the whole episode of state capture and then the work of the Zondo Commission helped, I think, to crystallize public awareness, especially of the abuses that were taking place in the public procurement space, with the coal that Eskom was buying, or the trains that PRASA was attempting to procure, even though they were to the wrong size for our tracks and so on. And clearly, there was a great deal of price inflation, corruption. There was a small group of people that was being enriched through the process, but the great mass of South Africans was not getting those contracts and was not getting the benefit of the services that they should have been receiving, for example, for your schools. Um, so I think that helped to focus attention on it. And then I think there's also been an awareness as our economy has done worse and worse, particularly in the last decade. We've had unemployment rising. It's become very obvious that the great mass of Black people are not benefiting from BEE. And perhaps that has also raised questions about why this is so and whether BEE is the best solution. And there is, I think, increasing evidence, what people are also beginning to say now in increasing number, that BEE helps a relatively small Black elite, many with close connections to the ruling party. But it either leaves out or it actively harms the great mass of poor Black people who don't have a chance to benefit from the preferences, but do experience all the negative consequences when the state becomes dysfunctional, when schools can't do a proper job, when clinics don't have medicines to provide and don't keep the place clean, for example, and particularly when they can't get jobs. And one of the reasons that unemployment is so high is that BEE's complexity, its unrealistic demands, are a major deterrent to direct investment. We need businesses to be pouring additional money into new mines, into new factories, into new shopping centers, into a whole range of enterprises that would be employing people, adding to consumer demand in the country, adding to the productivity of the economy. And instead, we have this kind of frozen situation where a lot of benefit is going to a very small elite, and the majority are frozen out. They're not getting the look in, and their situation is deteriorating all the time. And so, in my view, we need urgently to move away from BEE to something which will do better.
I think that scenario, those scenarios that you're describing, are what give a lot of us public dissonance. Is this idea that these policies are meant to transform the economy, draw more people into the economy, particularly impoverished Black communities, and yet they've only worked for a few. And if you make that claim publicly, you'll be heavily criticized or even be accused of trying to maintain, the status quo. Only um, white people retain most of the wealth at the expense or whilst keeping Black people out. EED is our proposal. It is a move away from this fake transformation that we've had over the last couple of decades. Please tell us more about EED, how it differs from BEE, and what some of its proposals are.
Right. So it differs from BEE in three core ways. First of all, it's entirely non-racial. We know that BEE can only work by classifying people by race, so that we supposedly know, who fits in what race or group. But EED doesn't use race as a proxy for disadvantage. It cuts to the heart of the matter by asking who is disadvantaged. And we can tell that in terms of a means test. So that's its first different element. And the second thing is it says we need a very different scorecard, because what we need is something that will encourage business to invest, to expand, to take on people into more jobs, to provide effective training, to be able to pay more into the tax revenues so that there is more public money available for core needs, to improve innovation so that, for example, we can start digging out the gold that is 5 kilometers beneath the ground using AI. There are all sorts of things where we need business to be stepping up, adding to the productivity of the economy, adding to the opportunities that people have. And BEE is just making them afraid to invest anymore at all. So we have a different EED scorecard, which is voluntary. Business doesn't have to do it. But I think many businesses may want to show what contribution they're making to the economy. And they can do so by recording what direct investments they've made, how many people they've employed, ideally how many more additional people they've managed to employ in a given year, how much tax they and their employees have paid into the tax authorities, thereby giving the government the capacity to do things like sustain social grants for those who really need them. And then you also have the possibility that the economy, through this emphasis on innovation, research development, better skills training, will be becoming increasingly productive, and that helps to make growth expand again. The more the economy expands, ideally by 7% a year, we would find the economy doubles in size within a 10-year period. And that's an extraordinary thought. An economy double the size of what we have now. That would really provide opportunity. And the EED scorecard would help achieve that. And then we also need to recognize that there are very many poor people who really have so little chance at the moment in the situation that we have with our faith transformation. So EED also has an element that reaches right down to the grassroots by providing poor families with tax-funded housing, healthcare, and education vouchers. Why vouchers? Because the country is already spending a great deal of money on these core needs: education to improve people's skills, healthcare to give them the opportunity for treatment when they need it, housing to improve living conditions, and yet we get very little bang for our buck. And there are examples of how vouchers have been used in other countries where you take pretty much the same amount of money that the state is now spending badly, and you divide it up among the people who are in need in the form of vouchers. And then each family gets its voucher, whether it's say for schooling, and then they have a choice. What school do they want their child to go to? Because with the help of the tax-funded voucher, they can pay for that school. And you will find that all schools must now start competing for the custom of voucher-bearing families. And so the state schools at the moment, which have no particular incentive to improve, they get the money flowing into their coffers every year, irrespective of whether they do well or not. Teachers have no particular incentive to teach better. The whole system is very bureaucratic and top-down, centralized. Now schools are in charge of their own teaching and service staff and so on. And they must also think, how can we be better than our competitors? How can we attract and keep voucher-bearing pupils? And you will find state schools upping their game, many more independent schools being created, perhaps some community schools as well. And so there will be a much better choice available to parents. And the voucher will follow their child to the school that they've selected. If their school does badly, they can withdraw the child and the voucher and go elsewhere. So it keeps everybody on their toes. It promotes innovation, and the competition also makes sure that schools have to be delivering the best for the least amount of money. And that's a completely different atmosphere from what we have now, where people just basically have to accept what little and how badly done it is that the state offers. And I think nothing could be more truly empowering for families than to feel that they now have the same sort of choice that currently is available only to the middle class, that they're the consumers and suppliers must meet their needs.
I'm particularly a big fan of this voucher system because of that shift in mentality that you're describing, where currently, if you're impoverished in South Africa, you not only have to accept whatever services are granted to you, but you also have to be grateful, right? Even if it's bad, you have sewage done down the road, you have, very poor performing schools. Hospitals are in a terrible state, and all you have to do is accept and be grateful. However, with a voucher system, right, where you have more autonomy, you can decide what to do with your money, you elect where to invest your money, and you have a vested interest in the outcome and in the performance of those, schools. So you'll be more interested in what happens in the education of your child. That's
Yeah,
sort of the shift in mentality that EED and this voucher system that you're speaking to introduces. But I think another core idea is that BEE obviously engenders patronage, right? This ability for politicians to stuff the government with their friends, their families, those who are politically connected, those who swear loyalty and kiss the ANC ring. When you take away that element of patronage and people are hired on the basis of merit, taking into advantage background and disadvantage, then those perverse incentives to hire people who may not be qualified or who may be qualified but still benefit from being politically connected or already well off, you're also taking and pulling that rug away from, the ANC, who have exercised it and wielded that power very influentially. Um,
exactly. Mm. No,
so
at the moment we have a top-down, very centralized system, and it lends itself to corruption and abuse. And that's we've been witnessing that in increasing measure. And the poor are just dependent on what the government provides or fails adequately to provide. And I think we should see that the government should be nothing more than a conduit for, the tax revenue has to be collected by SARS. The government then should just be a conduit for the benefit of poor families, so that the tax revenues flows through to poor families for use only for these specifically very important purposes, which are housing, education, and healthcare. And we don't add to the amount of money that we're spending, which we simply can't afford to do. We redirect the revenue and make sure that it's much more efficiently spent by people who have, as you say, a real stake, who want to see a good outcome for they really do want value for the money they've been given some control over.
absolutely. I think what you've also seen in government is they've splintered these departments, which is how you end up with this enormously bloated cabinet. They've splintered these government departments from DTI to DTIC to Department of Small Business and Development. And that's not how you create jobs or even how you grow an economy. What that does is it keeps money that should be going to ordinary South Africans. It keeps it in government paying salaries and in increasing the civil service, right? Rather than actually taking that money and putting it directly into the hands of South Africans through this voucher system. Let's talk about the exit strategy for EED. One of our concerns as South Africa is that we've created the system of perpetual welfare where it's generational. It's the grandmother who receives welfare, then the mother, then the child, and that just keeps people in poverty. What we want to see are people, be independent, exercise autonomy, get jobs, be able to provide for themselves and their families. What's the exit strategy for EED, and how does it differ from lifelong dependency that BEE promotes?
Mm. I think one we must acknowledge that to begin that we will need to keep the social grant system in place as well. So EED wouldn't be affecting that. But the whole concept with EED is you get a dynamic, productive, growing economy in which many more people have now the opportunity to earn a living. So I believe that many people who need the vouchers at the beginning will graduate from them because their incomes will rise above the level where the voucher applies. And we will see then that they increasingly can take care of their own needs. Um, and this is one of the most healthy attributes that you can actually find in a country where there isn't just a dependence on the state, but there are empowered citizens who have the capacity to meet their own needs, who have therefore much more influence over what the government does. I think at present we're in a situation where many people don't particularly like government policies, including BEE. We've seen in our surveys that they don't believe that it helps them, that they do see a worry about cronyism, but they have so little capacity to influence what the centralized top down government does. we can move to a situation of much greater autonomy at the individual level and much greater capacity for people to chart their own path through the economy and be responsible for the upliftment that they will see for themselves and their children.
Yeah. So there you have it. I mean, if that doesn't sound like true transformation, then I'm not sure what is. Because what we're describing is a system that targets people rather than on the basis of race, which causes this patronage system that just, you know, enriches those who are well connected or already well off. It actually identifies people who, on the basis of, means and means tests them, and since a majority of poor people in South Africa are Black, that means majority of the people who benefit from EED will be Black, right? Except that currently the system only benefits those who are already well off, and again pretends that this is transformation. You've also described a voucher system, which I'm a big fan of, and just a breakaway in various forms of mentalities that have really kept us poor, and these obstacles that stifle growth. You've also described a doubling in the economy in the next 10 to 20 years, which that's very hard to imagine. Anthea, what does a doubling of the current economy look like? That'll be my last question to you before I start with questions in the chat. If you have any questions for Anthea, remember to put them in the chat. I'll move on to your questions shortly after she answers the last one from me about what the double the size of the economy. What does that look like?
I think it's very hard for us to imagine because we are sort of used to what we have. But obviously, it means that we have now a big expansion in every economic sector. We have they're more productive farmers, they're more productive miners. We can go through all the different sectors of the economy and say that each of them will be expanding fast. What we'll also be doing is able to take advantage of export markets. I remember seeing a report was done in 2007 in which Trevor Manuel participated, which looked at how certain countries had been able to maintain that 7% growth rate, which doubles the economy every 10 years over a long period. And the answer was one of the things they had done was to exploit the rest of the world economy. You must be able to sell into other markets. If you're only trying to sell into your own market, you end up with not having a big enough market to meet your needs. So yeah, I can't give a very clear picture of it, but it's going to be something dynamic, something where you are constantly reaching out, you're constantly innovating. I mentioned, for example, being able to dig out gold 5 kilometers below the ground, but also maybe have a wonderful broadband system which covers the entire country, which everybody access to broadband. Give everybody literacy, give everybody numeracy, access to broadband, and who knows what our entrepreneurs, nascent entrepreneurs in the country, are going to come up with, and how they will be able to sell into the rest of the world, and how their lives will be truly transformed by a growing economy which doesn't confine its benefits just to the cadres who are loyal to the ANC, but gives everybody in the country a true chance to get ahead.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Now, moving on to the questions. I am seeing one here from Fanyan Kornbrink. Please forgive me if I'm saying that incorrectly. He speaks of Gigi Alcock and some of the stats from Capitec. Um, Oh, wait, that doesn't. It says question comments. I've been listening to Gigi Alcock and some stats from Capitec, and it has been fascinating. It does seem that a lot of people, especially people who are Black, are empowered and employed. However, employed in the informal sector, running small survivalist businesses, making the unemployment figures much lower if, capital if, we take into account informal employment and running your own little business. Taking this into account, it is in a way another nail in the coffin of BEE not being useful. Do you have anything to say to that, Anthea?
Mm. Yes, I've also been very intrigued by those figures. So I've been trying to follow the debate to some extent. And sort of very learned comments from Stats South Africa and others who say, well, they use the accepted global way of measuring informal economies, and they are satisfied that though their figures might not be quite right, they can't be that wrong. And on the other hand, I see that we do have, from everything that Gigi Alcock says, and also now the Capitec outgoing CEO, a level of vibrant entrepreneurship in township economies, which is a very important asset for the country. But I think it's difficult for those entrepreneurs ready to expand, partly because once they formalize, they become subject to BEE. They become subject to all the unrealistic demands that the government imposes on them. There are also major problems with our labor laws, for example, which impose national minimum wages, which are quite out of sync with the equivalent rules in other countries, where they recognize you can't put a national minimum wage at much the same as a median wage, because automatically then you're making half of your employment illegal. We pretty much we've gone far down that path in South Africa. That's not helpful. So those are the sorts of barriers which also keep the informal sector small. And of course, we need also for every aspect of our infrastructure and logistics system to function well, there must be reasonable broadband, reliable across the country. There must be good rail and road networks. The ports must function. The electricity must function. The water and the sanitation must function. All the things which currently prevent the entrepreneurs from getting ahead must be sorted out. And BEE is such an obstacle to doing it because it insists on the management, the employment quotas, which can't realistically be met. It insists on the preferential procurement, which wastes so much money. But abandon all these things, and I think we could see our informal sector really expanding. It's a wonderful foundation. I think it's very important that it should be more carefully tracked. This, I think, is what the Capitec outgoing CEO and people in the presidency and Operation of Vulindlela have agreed that they're going to do, so that we can have a clearer sense of just how big it is. But what we mostly need is a clearer sense of how we can make it grow and thrive and become more productive, more innovative, and more able to take advantage of overseas markets, which would really see it take off.
Yeah, I can't help but agree. The NDP had these objectives that by 2030, small and medium-sized enterprises will create 90% of the jobs, and we're very far away from that goal. And the government itself acknowledges that that's because a disproportionate bulk of the regulatory compliance environment harms small enterprises particularly. Um,
Mm.
so it is true that we've tied the hands of small entrepreneurs behind their backs whilst they're eagerly awaiting to make a meaningful contribution to the economy. And whilst the government itself wants them to, it just struggles to create that enabling environment, which BE contributes to those obstacles. We have another question here from Ritsofatse Mahuma, who says poverty and disadvantage in South Africa is largely along racial lines. So, my question is, with full understanding on the incidence of poverty, how will your transformation policy not be along racial lines? EED and BEE, oh, I think this he adds this much later. EED and BEE sound just the same. Maybe the difference is implementation. Or are problems based on who is providing the policy or whether the prognosis of the illness is correct?
Right. So let's just start again with why the ANC wants a race-based system. And a large part of the reason is so long as the key criterion is racial identity, call it skin color, who can be identified as black, it means that, as Ramaphosa said perhaps it was a couple of years ago, when he acknowledged that the ANC was accused number one on corruption, he also said, we know that the sons and the daughters of our colleagues, our comrades, they know about the contracts that are coming up, and then they position themselves to get those contracts. So as long as it is race-based rather than income-based, those sons and daughters and many other in the ANC elite will continue to benefit. And the great majority of ordinary black people will be frozen out, as is happening now. Whereas if you say we want to make the key criterion disadvantage in terms of a means test, then, as William Gumedi has said, rich black people will be treated the same way as whites and they will not be entitled to preferences. But we will instead have a way of growing the economy and individually empowering the people who are really poor now. So we grow the economy by having a different scorecard, which recognizes and rewards business for sensible things like investing, like employing, like paying taxes, like putting money into research and development. And we reach down to the grassroots and we empower people who are poor on a means test with the capacity to get good education for their children, good housing, good healthcare, all of which helps to make them more productive in the context of an economy which is finally growing instead of being held static by BEE in particular. So I think the difference would be very great because um, we would no longer have a stifled, hobbled economy in which the benefits of transformation are really accruing only to a small, basically politically connected elite. Uh, we could also, I think, move away from the concept of demographic representativity, which is not a norm in any country. It's a myth across the world. Thomas Sowell of Stanford University has tried to find evidence of demographic representativity applying in any countries across the world, and he said it just does, it's not found, and other economists and experts have come to the same conclusion. And Thomas Sowell has said so long as you have a race-based system, it's basically like a bait and switch system. You talk about the plight of the poor, and then you get obviously a great deal of sympathy, a sense that something must be done about this. And then you put in place a race-based empowerment policy, which works for the benefit of the rich black people and not the poor black people, because the rich black people are so much better credentialed, often very better educated, and they do have that political access, which gives them knowledge of the tenders before they come out and the opportunity to be in touch with the right people who can make a tender happen, and so on. So you talk about the plight of the poor, but a race-based system will then actually benefit the elite. And we need to break that. And we know if we use a means test, there will be a few. There are some poor white people. Uh, some of them will qualify for the vouchers as well. But because we're a majority black country, and unfortunately because poverty is predominantly black still, it is predominantly people who would be classified as black who would benefit from the system. The key
Mm.
thing is to get away from the idea that you have a static pie which you're now going to divide up in a certain way, to see an expanding pie. Because you have to have an expanding pie if you're going to be able to accommodate for a population which is growing all the time. Part of our tragedy is that our rate of economic growth has been lower than our rate of population growth. So all South Africans on average are getting poorer all the time. We must break that mold, have an expanding economy with opportunities for everybody, and we deliberately help through the vouchers people who are most in need in three core spheres, which will help them live better, become much more productive, and see that this, through the schooling system, adult education, universities, etc., the voucher system can be applied throughout the education system. You can also get a much better skilled population quite quickly, which can also become a further impetus to growth and benefit from growth.
Mm. I love that you pan to history because people perhaps underestimate how we're not unique in this. We're just at the tail end of, patronage, because you throughout history from 14th century China to 18th and 17th century Britain, you had the system that largely ensured that children of the aristocracy benefited the most, right? But the moment you you ensure that even the child of a domestic worker or gardener, that those people can apply to enter, for example, in the UK, can apply to enter Ivy League schools and can do that on their own strength rather than getting in because you're the son of a lawyer or you're the, the daughter of so and so. But that even the poorest of the poor can have access to those economic opportunities. That is truly how you're going to achieve economic inclusion and true transformation. We have, let's see, 4 more minutes of Q&A. And a question from Christo Smith, who asks, he says, many qualified, willing, and able people, some retired, want to mentor and coach younger people, transferring knowledge and skills, but we are not allowed due to BEE policies. How can we address that? And later, Ada Rebelo, sorry if I'm saying that incorrectly, says, hi, Crystal, I'm one of those retirees who is qualified, able, and willing to train interns in my industry, but I'm excluded due to my age. And yeah, I'm not sure if you have anything to say to
Mm.
that.
I think just that, these are part of the sad elements of our society, that BEE so often makes it more difficult for people to contribute than when they would really like to do so. And it's the great majority of disadvantaged South Africans who pay the price for that. All I can say is that under an EED system, these kinds of crazy constraints would not apply. A school would be overjoyed. It's now got voucher bearing pupils at it. It wants the best possible results. It would want anybody who can come and help and train and mentor. The SETA system, which has worked so extremely badly, under which all employers pay 1% of payroll to state entities, which really don't provide much effective training, and to which cadres may be deployed, as we saw recently with the attempt to put Gwede Mantashe's son as a chairman of one of the SETAs. Those would also simply go, and we would have perhaps a voucher system that could underpin a new apprenticeship system where both public and private providers can compete to do the best possible service, and would have a great need for people with skills and a willingness to impart them to others.
Hmm. One last question as we wrap up. It's one from Bianca Dineski. She says, I think the idea of EED could be a solution in our failing state. But how does one implement this? How does one get rid of all the cadre deployed, inefficient state employees, so called managers? And how does one change the mentality of entitlement, the lack of shame, the greed, and the general lack of moral values? Sure, that's a big one, Anthea.
That is a big one, and it's a tough one because, of course, the vested interests which have benefited from BEE will dig in and will try to defend it. And unfortunately, too, this emphasis on BEE is part of the ANC's commitment to the National Democratic Revolution, which is its strategy for moving the country away from a free market system towards a socialist economy in which the state has ever more control. I think where we must put our faith and our hope and our strategies is in the realization that ordinary people have really very little liking for ANC policies. So, and we also know, so just very briefly on that, we know from the IRR polling, from other opinion polls, that most people have very little faith in BEE or in the idea of land reform. They don't want land to farm. And they don't have particular faith in redistribution. They recognize that you need a growing economy. What they want to see is growth and jobs and black and white people working together for the benefit of all. So we also know that support for the ANC has been dropping for a long time. In 2009, for the first time, there were more people that stayed away from the polls than voted for the ANC. And that number of stay away votes, as opposed to the number of people going out to vote for the ANC, the gap between them has kept widening. So to the point where we had in the 2024 election a very small group that went out to vote for the ANC and a very large group that stayed at home or tried to find some alternative in a smaller, perhaps new party. That's where our great opportunity lies. that we are still a functioning democracy, that there are people thoroughly disillusioned with the ANC, and we need political parties that can really craft the most effective policies, I would hope along the lines of at least incorporate an EED approach. And this will be resonating with the views and the values of ordinary people. It means that the electorate has the possibility to vote out the whole cadre, patronage network, and the ANC that runs it. And we can do it beginning in 2026 at the local government level and then in 2029.
Indeed. Unfortunately, we've gone slightly over time. I must thank you all for joining this webinar about EED, which is a product of the What South Africa Can Be campaign. You can find out more about the What South Africa Can Be campaign on the IRR website, and there you can sign petitions to support many of these draft policies. The Freedom from Poverty Bill, which hosts EED, is just one. There are many others. We've released 4 so far. There will be a few more that we'll be releasing in the year. Anthea, I am so grateful to have you here and to have this conversation with you. Thank you to a very engaging audience. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all the questions. What that does say, Anthea, is that we should do this perhaps more often, or one more before we end the year. We'll let you know if that does happen. Thank you all, and I hope you have a good rest of your afternoon. Goodbye.
Thank you, Makone, and